what, 9 a.m., around 9, give it another hour. We'll see what the media will make of it. I think, just like you said, the reality is that siblings, they fall out, they fall in, and I would like to see that as siblings, they get on, that they find their common ground again, right? But the problem is the British people, British media will not let them. People today are now going to be picking on every single thing from their body language to whether he smiled a certain way to how they received each other. I mean, that's just, it's beyond daft.
He is triggering for the media, isn't he, Angela? The papers...
Because they want to make money off him.
Oh,
that's why.
Shola, you're great, but I have to, I absolutely disagree with everything that you've said, although I'd fight to the death. You're right to say it, but you're bang wrong. But
I'm not on that one.
You don't think the papers have got it in for him?
I think it's such a blunt instrument to say it's the media's fault. It's it's always the papers. It's the juiciest of stories, isn't it? Two brothers, royal brothers, princes fall out, and then you have that toxic interview that they both gave to Oprah. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Can I just remind you? Sorry, comma there, just before I finish very quickly, is to say that we forget the very critical role that the media play in this country in calling public figures to account. We'll mention later.
That's
Matt
not what
Hancock.
We're talking about.
It was a national newspaper that broke the story.
But that's not what we're talking about.
It isn't. But what you're saying is you're slamming the whole media.
I am and with evidence and with legitimate grounds that when it has come to Harry, when it has come to his relationship with his family, that the media has benefited from creating stories that are not stories.
What about the Oprah interview?
And the Oprah interview, they spoke their truth. They spoke what happened, and what you had was certain members of the media institution decided to lay it in on them, and
it was dished up on a plate.
Before the Oprah interview, for years, during Harry and Meghan's engagement and when they got married, what you saw was that a majority of the British media were attacking them. No, of course.
No,
you
not
disagree.
of course.
Why?
No, I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because
They told lies. They used negative stereotypes on Meghan Markle. They did all of this.
Let Angela answer.
When Harry and Meghan got engaged, there was the most enormous reservoir of goodwill. If I could counsel you to go and look at some of the lead columnists who wrote about it, the kind of the fundamental view was fantastic. This boy, he's been lost for years. This motherless boy, so damaged from having to walk behind his mother's coffin. He's found somebody. He can have the family he's always craved for. Look at Meghan. She's going to bring such diversity.
Oh my goodness. I think once again, this is just another example of selective amnesia. Because when they were dating, on your part, because I think you're picking on, some said. Bottom line is, if it was so great, No. If it was so great, why did Prince Harry have to come out and say all of these racist undertones in British media? This was before they got married.
There is a moment in every argument when the conversation stops being about what happened and starts being about who gets to control the story. And I believe that is exactly where we are with Harry and Meghan. Because for years, the public has been told a very convenient version of events. A version where Harry and Meghan are always the problem, where Harry is supposedly the bitter brother, where Meghan is supposedly the ambitious outsider, where the royal family is simply an innocent institution caught in the middle, and where the British media is merely an innocent observer, standing on the sidelines, reporting whatever happens to be unfolding. But what if that is not the full story? What if the media didn't simply report the royal family drama? What if the media became one of the characters in the drama? And what if, instead of asking why two brothers became estranged, we should be asking who benefited from keeping that estrangement alive? Sussex gang, welcome back. Today, I want us to go somewhere a little deeper, because I have been watching this debate and something keeps bothering me. Every time Harry and Meghan's story is discussed, the conversation somehow circles back to their choices, their interviews, their decision to leave, their decision to speak, their decision to build a life outside Britain. But the question I don't hear enough is this. What happened before they made those decisions? Because decisions do not happen in a vacuum. People make choices in response to circumstances. And sometimes, when you look closely at those circumstances, you begin to understand why someone eventually says, "Enough, I am done." And that is where I think Dr. Shola Mos-Shogbamimu's intervention becomes so important. Because she challenged something that has become almost automatic in discussions about Harry and Meghan, the idea that the media is simply reporting a family conflict. No, Dr. Shola's argument is much more uncomfortable. She is essentially saying that the media has not merely documented the royal rift, the media has participated in it. And Sussex gang, I want you to think about that. Because imagine two brothers who are already experiencing difficulties. Now imagine millions of people watching them. Every glance is analysed. Every facial expression becomes a headline. Every missed invitation becomes evidence. Every photograph becomes a psychological profile. One brother attends an event. The other brother doesn't. Breaking news. One brother looks serious. The royal rift deepens. One brother smiles. Experts react. One brother doesn't smile. Tensions explode. At some point, you have to ask yourself, how is any family supposed to heal under that kind of microscope? And more importantly, who benefits from keeping the wound open? Because conflict is profitable. Conflict generates clicks. Conflict sells newspapers. Conflict creates television debates. Conflict fills social media feeds. Conflict keeps audiences coming back. The happy ending is often the end of the story. But the unresolved feud, that can run forever. And that, to me, is one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire saga. Because we are constantly told that Harry and Meghan are obsessed with the royal family. Yet look at the media cycle. Who keeps bringing them up? Who keeps analysing their every move? Who keeps comparing their popularity? Who keeps discussing whether Harry will return? Who keeps speculating about whether William will reconcile with Harry? Who keeps turning every royal event into a referendum on Meghan? The Sussexes can be thousands of miles away, building their own lives, working on their own projects, raising their family, supporting causes they care about. And somehow the conversation still comes back to them. That tells you something. The Sussex story is not simply a story about two people who left the institution. It is a story about what happens when two people leave a system that still wants to control the narrative surrounding them. And this is where I think the phrase selective amnesia deserves serious attention. Because there seems to be a strange rewriting of history. Suddenly, people talk about Harry and Meghan as if they entered the royal family surrounded by nothing but warmth, affection, and universal goodwill. Really? Are we supposed to forget everything that happened before the wedding? Are we supposed to forget Harry's long-standing concerns about the British press? Are we supposed to forget that Harry had already spoken publicly about the destructive nature of media intrusion? Are we supposed to forget the debates about how Meghan was covered compared with other members of the royal family? Are we supposed to pretend that every headline was neutral, every photograph fair, every commentator objective, every criticism proportionate? Because that is where I believe the conversation becomes intellectually dishonest. You cannot discuss the Sussex story honestly while pretending the media environment did not exist. And let me be clear, criticism is part of public life. Harry and Meghan are public figures. They are not immune from scrutiny. Nobody should be. But scrutiny and hostility are not the same thing. Accountability and obsession are not the same thing. Journalism and narrative warfare are not the same thing. And criticism should never be confused with a license to dehumanize people. That distinction matters, because when you look at the coverage surrounding Meghan in particular, the debate has often gone far beyond legitimate criticism. The question is not whether every negative story was motivated by racism. That would be an oversimplification. The question is whether race and unconscious bias have sometimes influenced the way stories about her were framed. And that is a completely different question. It is a question worth asking, because the media does not exist in a vacuum either. Journalists are human beings. Editors are human beings. Audiences are human beings. And societies carry biases. So when a woman of mixed heritage enters one of the world's most historically traditional institutions, it is entirely legitimate to examine whether the standards applied to her were truly equal. And that brings me to something I believe the Sussex gang should always remember. You don't have to believe that every criticism of Meghan was racist to acknowledge that racism can exist within a system. You don't have to believe that every journalist had malicious intentions to acknowledge that patterns can emerge. You don't have to believe that every negative headline was coordinated to recognize that repeated narratives can have consequences. And you don't have to believe that Harry and Meghan are perfect to believe that they deserve fairness. Those ideas can coexist. But the problem is that nuance is often the first casualty of a media war. The moment you defend Meghan, you're accused of worshipping her. The moment you defend Harry, you're accused of hating his family. The moment you criticize the press, you're accused of attacking free speech. And suddenly the actual conversation disappears. This is why I think the Oprah interview remains such an important turning point. Now, whether people agreed with everything said in that interview is a separate discussion. But let's ask a simple question. What happens when people feel that nobody is listening to them? What happens when they believe the official narrative does not reflect their experience? Eventually, they find their own microphone. And that is what Harry and Meghan did. They found a platform. They spoke. They explained. They challenged. And for many people, that was the moment the balance of power shifted. Because for generations, royal families have traditionally been discussed by institutions, newspapers, broadcasters, historians, and commentators. But suddenly, here were two members of the royal family speaking directly to millions of people. No palace press release, no carefully controlled briefing, no anonymous royal source, just their version of events. And whether you agreed with them or not, that changed the conversation. Of course, the reaction was explosive. Because when people who have been discussed for years finally start discussing themselves, the people who benefited from controlling the narrative can feel threatened. And this is where I think we need to understand the bigger picture. The Sussex story is not just about Harry and Meghan. It is about who controls information. It is about who gets believed. It is about whose perspective is treated as legitimate. And perhaps most importantly, it is about what happens when people challenge an established hierarchy. Because Harry and Meghan didn't simply leave Britain. They challenged the idea that leaving the institution meant surrendering their voice. And that is a very different thing. They stepped away from royal duties, but they did not step away from their right to speak. They did not surrender their humanity. They did not agree to become silent characters in somebody else's story. And perhaps that is why their story remains so controversial. Because the Sussexes have refused to play one particular role, the role of the permanently grateful outsiders who should quietly disappear. Instead, they built a new life. They pursued projects. They created a family environment outside the royal institution. They continued charitable work. They created media content. They spoke about issues that mattered to them. And they did something that, in my opinion, is incredibly important. They demonstrated that identity can exist outside institutional approval. That is powerful. And maybe that's why the media fascination continues. Because Harry and Meghan represent a question that goes beyond the monarchy. Can you leave a powerful institution and still define yourself? Can you walk away from the traditional path and create another one? Can you reject the role assigned to you and write your own? That is what makes the Sussex story so compelling. And Sussex gang, this is where I want to challenge us as well. We should never become so emotionally invested in defending Harry and Meghan that we stop thinking critically. Our strength should be in our ability to question narratives, to examine evidence, to challenge double standards, to recognize legitimate criticism while rejecting unfair treatment. Because if we are going to defend the Sussexes, let's do it intelligently. Let's not simply replace one form of blind loyalty with another. Let's demand consistency. Let's demand fairness. Let's ask why some royal family members are praised for protecting their privacy while Harry and Meghan are criticised for doing the same. Let's ask why one person's ambition is celebrated as leadership while another person's ambition is framed as arrogance. Let's ask why certain interviews are treated as harmless public relations while others are described as attacks on the monarchy. Let's ask why some members of the royal family can make mistakes and move forward, while Harry and Meghan seem to be expected to carry every controversy forever. And most importantly, let's ask why reconciliation is always presented as Harry's responsibility. Think about that. The story is often framed as, will Harry return? Will Harry apologise? Will Harry make peace? Will Harry reach out? But what about the other side? What does reconciliation actually require? Does it require accountability? Does it require understanding? Does it require both sides to acknowledge what happened? Because reconciliation is not the same thing as surrender. And forgiveness is not the same thing as pretending nothing happened. Sometimes people can love each other and still need boundaries. Sometimes families can be connected by blood and divided by circumstance. And sometimes healing requires distance before it can require closeness. That is why I refuse to accept the simplistic narrative that Harry and Meghan are somehow responsible for every fracture surrounding them. Families are complicated. Institutions are complicated. Media ecosystems are complicated. Human beings are complicated. And anyone presenting this entire saga as a simple story of two villains and a perfect institution is selling you a fantasy. The truth is much more uncomfortable. There were tensions. There were disagreements. There were competing narratives. There were media pressures. There were personal decisions. There were institutional dynamics. And there were consequences. But somewhere in the middle of all this noise are two human beings who made a choice. They chose a different life. And perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the Sussex story is that, despite everything, they kept moving. That is the part I find most powerful. Not the headlines, not the palace gossip, not the endless body language analysis, not the daily speculation. The movement. Harry and Meghan kept moving. They built, they adapted, they created, they endured. And every time someone predicted that they would disappear, they found another way to continue. And that is why I believe the Sussex gang should pay attention to what is happening right now. The future of Harry and Meghan cannot be measured by whether a newspaper approves of them. It cannot be measured by whether a royal commentator gives them permission to succeed. It cannot be measured by whether the British media decides they have finally earned the right to be respected. Their future belongs to them. And perhaps that is the real story. Maybe the most radical thing